Welcome back everyone to another NASCAR Heat 5 setup. Today's video will focus on Richmond Raceway. And after doing several of the larger tracks to get us started in NASCAR Heat 5, I wanted to move on to a short track, and Richmond is one of my favorites. Absolutely love racing this track. Now the AI in the game have their own set of issues, but that is a topic for a different video. Today we're going to focus on the fun that is Richmond Raceway. Of course, we're going to be talking about the Cup cars as well as Xfinity and the trucks, so let's get started. Before we get into the setup discussion, there's a few other pieces of information that I wanted to pass along. First, be sure to check out the video I did talking about NASCAR Heat 4 setups in NASCAR Heat 5. In the video, I talk about whether or not these Heat 4 setups work in Heat 5, and also my approach to setups in NASCAR Heat 5. Next, let's talk about tire wear settings. I generally work with normal settings, so normal wear and normal tire wear fall off. And the reason I do that is so that we can get a very good baseline, which is the most important thing for me to pass along to you guys. That way, if you're using more aggressive tire wear settings, more wear, less grip as the tires wear, then you'll know that you need to tighten the car up some in order to save the tires, in particular the right rear. If you're using less aggressive settings, which would be less tire wear, more grip in the tires as they wear, then you know that you can get by with running a little bit looser setup. So using normal settings for both tire wear as well as grip fall off allows me to create that baseline. I do enjoy using the other settings, particularly having the more aggressive settings and less grip as the fall off happens, but I think normal on both tire wear and fall off gives us a very good baseline. Also, the focus of my setups is on stability. I don't focus so much on single lap speed or worry about single lap qualifying type speed. I'm more interested in the race and having a good car from the beginning of the run through the middle of the run and then finishing up the run strong as the fuel wears out. And then finally, when I'm doing setups for both Cup, Xfinity, as well as the trucks, I like to keep these as close to each other as possible so that it gives the same feel across all three series. In general, Xfinity and trucks run a little bit tighter for me using the same setup as I would use in the Cup cars. So in general, I'm going to loosen those up just a little bit in order to get the identical feel that I have with Cup. So with that out of the way, let's move into the setup. I'm actually going to be showing you two different setups here in the Cup car before we move on to Xfinity and the trucks. And the reason is, at every track in the game, how you drive the car matters. The more aggressive you are, the more tire wear you're going to get, and the more apt you are to burn the right rear off the car. But in the case of Richmond, I want to show you a couple of different setups for Cup, simply because if you are looking for more speed, then I'll show you one setup. That's the one we're looking at on the screen right now. But then I'm going to show you a secondary setup that is, for me, much tighter and much more conservative if you're having trouble over the long run. Particularly if you're doing 4X style runs, then the last 4, 5, 6 laps can be really tricky on exit because the car wants to get really loose. That's generally a sign that either the setup is too loose or you've been driving the car too aggressively over the course of a run. So it's something to keep in mind. And if you've never felt that feeling of getting back to the gas on corner exit and having the back end jump out on you and get really loose, then it's something you really should feel, and because it's a great indicator that maybe you need to back down a little bit lap after lap and quit pushing the car quite so hard. So we're going to see two setups, starting with my preferred setup on the screen right now. And the best thing to do, my best advice for you, is to look at the differences between the two setups. You'll notice that there's going to be a lot of similarities, but then there are going to be some very noticeable differences, and those will give you some indication as to ways that I go about tightening or loosening the car based on how I drive it. Starting with the shock settings. So 10 and 8 for bump and rebound across the board. You're going to see something different than that in the other setup. And the higher the numbers you use on the shocks, that's simply just going to get you a stiffer feel. So the suspension is going to feel stiffer overall. The transitions into and off the corners when you're on and off the gas, on and off the brakes, are going to feel quicker to you with higher numbers. So 10 and 8 is about the highest numbers I want to use for this track for a release video. You can definitely try higher numbers than that if you want a quicker feel, but there are some bumps in the braking zones that you will feel. If you get the shocks right and your driving style right, they'll be more of an annoyance than really any issue to you, but keep that in mind. The higher the numbers you use, the more you're going to feel those bumps. So 10 and 8 is what we're going for here for this setup, to give a slightly stiffer feel than what we'll see in the other setup for Cup. Moving on now to the weight settings. Maximum left side weight, because we're on an oval, turning left. And so there's no reason to really do anything other than max this out unless you're dealing with road courses, which is an entirely separate issue. Then we move on to the front weight at 53.5 and then the wedge at 52.0. I use the front weight in this setup to really stabilize the car on corner entry. It allows me to charge the corner entry a little bit harder if I want to without having to worry about the car getting out of control or unstable. So increasing the front weight up to toward the maximum of 55.0 will simply tighten the car up, make it more stable. The more you reduce the front weight, it's going to help the car to rotate more, but at the cost of some stability. So you have to find the balance there based on your driving style. Wedge is similar, but with wedge, we're dealing with how quick the car wants to rotate. The higher the number in wedge, up closer to that 55.0 max, the slower the car will rotate. It'll be much more stable, particularly on corner entry and corner exit, as the car wants to rotate slower. When you reduce the wedge, in this case down around 51 or 50 and so on, the car will rotate much quicker at the cost of stability. So it's very easy to make up lap time by reducing the wedge and or the front weight, simply because it's going to allow the car to rotate more. However, just keep in mind the stability as well as the fact that you're going to be using more of that right rear tire when you do so. Moving on to the spring settings, 1,200 pounds in the left front, 1,100 pounds in the right front. That's another area that's going to be different than what you're going to be seeing here shortly with the other Cup setup. So using a stiffer left front than right front spring helps the car rotate on entry. The more left front spring you have, the better the car will want to turn on entry. You pay the price a little bit with tightness on the exit, but if you really need to get down into the corner better, need the car to rotate better, then a higher number on the left front spring can help with that. For the right front spring, 1,100 pounds, so still very close to the maximum of 1,200, but backed off just 100 pounds, which really helps the entry of the corner. If you're too loose on entry, then increase that right front spring back up to or close to the 1,200 pounds. If you're still too tight on corner entry, in all likelihood it's because you're charging the corner too much. But if you need some help on corner entry getting the car to rotate, then dropping that right front spring to maybe 1,050 pounds or even 1,000 pounds will certainly do that for you. Moving on to the rear of the car, 450 in the left rear, 500 in the right rear. You're going to see some different options to that as we move to the other Cup setup, as well as in Xfinity and the trucks as well. This is the most aggressive I got with the rear spring, simply because the more rear spring I used, meaning the higher the numbers I used in the rear springs, the more the car rotates. And that really helps out with speed, but it can be at the cost of tire wear if you get too aggressive with your driving style. Only 50 pounds of split in the rear springs. That helps to keep the car stable on corner exit and allow me to be a little bit more aggressive with the throttle whenever I need to, such as when I'm trying to make a pass. So I really don't want to go much more than 50 pounds of rear spring split based on the rest of the values here in the setup. You can, if you're getting too loose on corner exit, then try reducing the difference between the left rear and the right rear spring. Maybe only 10 or 20 pounds will certainly stabilize the car on exit and really tighten up the car. Moving on now to the tires. I didn't spend a ton of time here with tire settings. 11 and 12 on the left sides, 30 and 28 on the right. Seem to work out very well. I approach the tires much the same way that I do with the springs, meaning that anytime I might want to help out the entry of the corner, I might add a little bit of left front spring to it, left front tire pressure, because much like the left rear spring, that can help you out on corner entry with helping the car to rotate. Same thing with the right front. If I am a little bit too tight on corner entry and I'm in the middle of a race, so I don't have an opportunity to move things around like the springs or the front weight, then I can drop that right front pressure a little bit, and that will help the car to rotate. If I'm too loose on corner entry, then during the race, I can simply come in and increase the right front pressure. So again, the same way I think about the spring settings is the same way I think about the tire pressure. But the tire pressure is one of the things you can change during the course of a race on a pit stop, so it is a very good tool to use. In the rear, left rear, the more left rear spring I put in it, or excuse me, I keep going back to the springs, the more left rear tire pressure that you put in the car, the tighter the car will be from the center of the corner on exit. But if I reduce the left rear tire pressure, then I'm going to free up the car. I'm going to loosen the car on corner exit. And then in the right rear corner, the more I increase the tire pressure, the looser the car will be on exit. If I drop the right rear tire pressure, then that's going to tighten the car on corner exit. Of course, there are always limitations to all of these. You don't want to go huge amounts there unless you are in big trouble as far as how your car is handling. Moving on now to the miscellaneous settings. So +3 and -3 on the camber, that simply works very well. You can go definitely beyond that, and you might see some gains in speed and or tire management depending on whether you increase or decrease these numbers. But +3 and -3 is a very good baseline for me and works well for a release setup. The front sway bar, 1.315, is a very good number. This is akin to what I used a lot in Heat 4, and it really helps the car to rotate. So the higher the number you use for front sway bar, if I go beyond the 1.315 to somewhere like 1.5, 1.7, and so on, that's really going to tighten the car up. It's going to slow down the rotation of the car and really add stability to the car overall. So the lower the number I use on the front sway bar, the more it's going to help the car to rotate. So you have to find a balance there. If you lower it too much, then the car will become unstable and you'll have to make a whole bunch of adjustments to the rest of the setup to try to stabilize the car back. So 1.315 works as a good middle ground for me. Moving on to the track bar, 11 inches on the left, 10 inches on the right. So higher on the left than the right. The reason I did that is because the higher the number you use on the left side, that's going to help your entry. So if you need to free up or loosen the corner entry, then increase that left side track bar. If you need to tighten up the entry, then drop the left side track bar. On the right side, 10 inches was a good number for the corner exit. But if you find that you need some help on corner exit, the car is simply too tight, then a way to loosen it is to increase the right side track bar. Maybe something like 10 1/4, 10 1/2, something like that should free up the car and help it to turn better on the exit. If on the other flip side of things, if you are too loose on corner exit, which I would imagine some of you are going to be, particularly on the longer runs, then drop the right side track bar, maybe 9 3/4, maybe 9 1/2, and so on, and that will certainly help as just another option that you can use to loosen or tighten the car. Brake bias is another difference you're going to see between the two setups. It's at 75%. That's a nice stable value I find in this game. Anywhere from about 72, 73 up to about 80 is perfectly fine. Again, just determined on how you drive the car. If you're more aggressive, you might need to lower this number a little bit to help the car to rotate. So with the brake bias, the lower the value you use, 72, 71, 70, and lower, that will help free the car up under heavy braking. So it's going to help the car rotate under braking. Increasing this number to 77 up to 80 and so on is going to tighten the car under braking. So another value that you can use to adjust the car specifically when you're on the brakes. Now I don't use a lot of brake at this place. Maybe 10, 15, maybe even 20% might be my heaviest braking. So not a lot there, but it's enough that you can use the brake bias to really adjust how you want the car to handle if you're doing things like trail braking it into the corner. Grill tape at 50%, did not spend much time at all here. All I care about with the grill tape is that we're not overheating. I try to get it fairly high and close to the 240, 250 degree level, but I don't really push my luck on that because it really doesn't have any value to me as far as the handling of the car. Just make sure you don't get the car overheating. You'll be fine. Wheel lock and steering offset, 10 degrees and 0.05, which are my standards. The wheel lock is really good for adjusting the rate of steering and the sensitivity of the steering. So if you want quicker steering, then increase that number up to the closer to the default of, which is I think 17 or 18, something along those lines, or even higher. In some cases, might feel more comfortable because it'll give you quicker steering response. If you feel like the steering response is just too quick, then drop that number down to 9, 8, 7, and so on, and that will slow down the steering. The steering offset is directly correlated to the amount of camber you have in the car. 0.05 works very well for me because the camber is around +3 or -3. This is simply there to adjust the amount you're going to have to turn to the right on the straightaway. So if you really don't want to be turning to the right on the straightaways very much at all, then increase the steering offset. Just be careful about getting it too high, because too high of a number will increase a pull to the right on the straightaway, which is certainly not something that you want to feel. Now, moving on to the gear settings. As normal, I didn't spend a lot of time with first, second, or third. I think I might have adjusted third gear just a little bit on some of the other setups we're going to see today, but not a whole lot that I wanted to do there for the release video. But then rear end ratio, 4.33 in the Cup car. That gets you up pretty close, if not at, the rev limiter. So you might need to make some adjustments there, but 433 is really good for a long run because as the speed falls off, it allows you to keep some RPM in the engine, even though you're losing speed overall. So that'll do it for Cup setup number 1. Now let's move over to the more conservative, tighter setup number 2. All right, here in the second setup, the more conservative setup in the Cup car, I'm going to point out just a few changes. I'm not even going to try to point out just everything because we've already covered everything really in the very first Cup setup. But a few things I do want to point out is in the shock settings here, you notice that I'm using the 5-3 combination on bump and rebound on each of the corners. And remember, as I say in every one of the videos, I try to keep the shock settings fairly standard. I don't get tricky with changes from corner to corner on the car. However, I'm certainly not telling you that you shouldn't do that. I just try to keep things fairly bland and fairly standard for the purposes of the release setup. There is a lot to be gained if you work corner by corner of the car on the shocks and also working with the bump versus the rebound. Certainly a lot of gains that you can make there, but that's beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do in the setup video. So 5.3, a very soft feel out of the shock, so a different feeling than what we saw in the 10.8 or a 10.7 setup from the first setup. So a little bit softer here. You're going to have more roll in the car into and off the corners, and you're going to feel that a little bit more. Moving on now to the weight settings. Front weight and wedge, you notice, are a little bit different. A little bit lower on the front weight, a little bit higher on the wedge. Just gives a different feel to the car, both on corner entry and corner exit, and fits a little bit different driving style. As I mentioned though, this setup is tighter for me, but it certainly helps preserve that right rear tire over the course of a long run. So if you're struggling with saving that right rear tire, this type of a setup might help you out at the cost of some speed, of course. Moving on to the spring settings. In the front of the car, you notice that we have the opposite of what we saw in the first setup here, a much softer left front spring, 800 versus the 1200 we saw initially. And then in the right front, we're back to the max of 1,200 pounds. What this does is tighten the car up on entry to the corner and under braking. So the car is not going to want to turn and rotate as much on corner entry. That's one of the reasons why you see less front weight in the car. That is a trade-off to help that get some of that rotation back in the car. Also, the left front spring being a little bit lower helps the car to turn on corner exit under throttle. So again, just different ways of going about achieving the same or similar results. In the rear of the car, 400 and 420 for the rear springs. Only 20 pounds of rear split. That is to, once again, tighten and stabilize the rear of the car. So also, both springs are lower than what we saw in the other setup where we had 450 and 500. So less rear spring overall, as well as less split. Both of those are going to combine to really tighten the car up, particularly on corner exit. Very similar in the tire pressures, in fact, maybe even exact. Moving on to the miscellaneous settings, you're going to see a lot of the same as what we've already taken a look at, except for the brake bias. Brake bias a little bit different here at 65%. So as I mentioned, the front springs are going to serve to tighten the car up under the entry of the corner. So less front weight, less brake bias are going to help to get some of that rotation back. So again, one of the things I wanted to show you guys is options. You have options on multiple ways of trying to accomplish the very same task. If you want the car to rotate better on corner entry, there are different options that you have to make that happen, and which one you ultimately choose will be based on your own testing and how you drive the car. Some of these will work better for me, others will work better for you. So it really does come down to testing, testing, and testing. All right, and then finally you see everything else looks more or less the same. I think third gear a little bit different here in this setup, but that's just me testing out different things. I generally prefer a little bit lower number on the third gear, closer to that 133, 140 number. So I dropped it, I play around with third gear a little bit in the setups, but other than that, not a whole lot going on. Now let's move into the Xfinity cars. We're not going to spend a great deal of time in either Xfinity or the trucks simply because we've already talked about this and the setups are very similar, if not identical in a lot of respects with what we've seen in the Cup cars. So the shock settings very much similar, same thing with the weight settings. One thing I did do with the springs in both Xfinity and I believe in trucks is I dropped the rear springs overall, but I did put a little bit more of the split in the rear spring. So 50 pounds of split, 400 in the left rear, 450 in the right rear. So dropped them a little bit. We talked about that briefly in the Cup car, how if you want to tighten the car up overall, maybe you're losing the right rear a little bit too much over the course of a long run, then drop both of the rear springs in the car and that will tighten it up a little bit. So I wanted to show you a little bit different look there. Other than that, everything very similar to what we've already seen until we get over to the gear settings. So rear end ratio of 444 was about the max I could get by with. We were pretty hard on the rev limiter at that, but it can really help you over the course of a long run as the speed drops off to maintain some RPM there and help you out a little bit on the speed. So that takes care of Xfinity. Now let's move finally into the trucks. The setup here in the trucks is very much the same as what we just took a look at with Xfinity, but one thing I did want to point out for the trucks is that the trucks for me at Richmond are a little bit tighter than even the Xfinity cars were. And what that means is over the course of a long run, the right front and the right rear tires were even more closely than they do in Xfinity, and that gives you a couple of opportunities. Number one, it's going to mean a more stable setup over the course of a long run, meaning that the right rear shouldn't wear quite as much as the Xfinity and definitely not as much as in the Cup car. So you can lean on that right rear a little bit more. It also means that that might be an opportunity for you to free the car up a little bit more than what we saw in Cup or Xfinity and get a little bit more speed out of it. So it all depends on your driving style, but for me, the truck is a little tighter than even the Xfinity cars, which presents some opportunities. That's going to do it for today. Thank you so much for joining me, and stay tuned as we'll continue our support for NASCAR Heat 5.